Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something I know you've all been thinking about: Christian stewardship.
Especially from that Seventh-day Adventist perspective
Exactly.
you've given us.
Yeah, a whole bunch of writings on this topic. And I'm really curious to see what we can uncover today. Get ready for some historical surprises and some really thought-provoking questions about what it all means for you.
What's so fascinating is how these sources really go beyond just thinking about money, you know?
Oh, okay.
They frame stewardship as a whole way of life.
I like that. Okay, so what are some of the core ideas that really stood out to you when you were reading through all this?
Well, the one that just keeps popping up over and over again is this idea that ultimately everything belongs to God.
Yeah.
Our time, our talents, the stuff we own,
Yeah.
they're all gifts from Him, right?
Yeah.
Entrusted to us for a purpose.
I can see how that really sets the stage for the whole conversation. It kind of flips the script on how we usually think about ownership, doesn't it?
Totally. One of the sources used this analogy of being God's business partner.
Okay.
And I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah.
We're managing and multiplying what He's already given us.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this one quote that just stuck with me. You would have nothing to give.
Okay.
Did He not first give to you?
That's pretty profound when you really think about it. It's not just about what we give back. It's about where it all came from in the first place.
Exactly. And that brings us to, one of the big things everyone thinks about when it comes to this: tithing. Giving a tenth of what we earn back to God.
Tithing. I have to admit, it's always kind of intrigued me, but I also get a little apprehensive about it. I mean, some people are so certain about it, and others, I don't know, they find it kind of burdensome. What did you find in these sources that you thought was particularly insightful about tithing?
What struck me was how they emphasize that it's not supposed to be this, heavy obligation. It's more like a joyful act of acknowledging where it all comes from and getting to be part of what God's doing,
Yeah.
participating.
I like that. It's about aligning our hearts with God's heart more than just following some rule, right?
Exactly. And I was fascinated to learn about, the history of tithing.
Oh, wow.
It goes way back, even before Moses.
Oh, wow.
Jacob made a vow to tithe at Bethel, way before the law was even given at Sinai.
See, I didn't know that. That adds a whole different dimension to it. So it's not just some Old Testament rule. It's woven into the story from the very beginning.
It is. And even Paul, who, often talked about grace over law,
go
he
back.
still acknowledged and supported tithing.
Huh. That's interesting. So we're called to be generous with what God has given us. But the sources also talk a lot about, kind of the flip side of that. What happens when we give in to selfishness and greed?
Yeah, they get pretty intense about that.
Yeah.
Lots of warnings about the dangers of selfishness and loving money more than God.
And they use some pretty strong imagery to drive that point home, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Was it one of these sources that talked about it being like leprosy?
Yes.
Because I remember seeing that being like, wow, that's some serious language.
Right. I mean, leprosy was a huge deal back then.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they're saying it can really eat away at us,
Yeah.
not just financially, but spiritually too.
It's so easy to think, well, I'm not greedy. I just want to be comfortable. I want to be secure.
Right?
But it does seem like there's a slippery slope there.
Totally. They even point to that story about the rich young ruler who couldn't follow Jesus because he was so attached to his wealth.
Oh, yeah. It's a good story.
Yeah.
It's a cautionary tale about how stuff can become an idol, can't it?
It really is.
And it can hinder our relationship with God. It's easy to read that story and think, well, I would never do that. But it makes you wonder, are there ways that we're clinging to things that are holding us back from truly following Jesus?
That's such a good question.
It's something to think about, isn't it?
It is. And I think that's where honesty with ourselves is so important,
Yeah.
Asking those hard questions. What do we really value? Where are we putting our time, energy, and resources? Are we seeking God's kingdom first, or are we trying to build our own little kingdoms here?
Those are some tough questions to wrestle with, but they're so important to ask.
Absolutely, because the sources are saying if we're not careful, we can get so caught up in getting more and more that we miss out on the true riches God has for us.
When you say true riches, are you talking about some kind of spiritual reward in the afterlife?
It's bigger than that. These writings emphasize that generosity isn't about getting something back financially or even just some spiritual reward later. It's about experiencing a change in us.
Right.
Right now, a new way of looking at things that changes everything.
So it's not just about what we give, it's about how it changes us in the process.
Exactly. And they talk about how that happens in some really interesting ways. One concept that stood out to me was this idea that 9/10 are worth more than 10/10 when we're faithfully giving.
Whoa, wait a minute. How can giving something away actually make the rest more valuable? I don't quite get that one. Can you explain a little more about what these writers were saying?
Well, it's not like some magic formula or anything, but it seems to be about a shift in our perspective.
Okay.
One of the sources talked about how when we align ourselves with God's principles of generosity, He blesses us in ways we could never have imagined.
So it's about tapping into a different kind of abundance, one that comes from aligning ourselves with God's heart, not just our own limited resources.
That's it. And they also talk about this link between generosity and being content, you know?
Oh, yeah.
When we're focused on giving, we're less likely to always be wanting more and more.
That makes sense. When we're always striving for more, we never really feel satisfied. But when we embrace generosity, it's like we tap into a deeper source of joy and contentment.
Exactly. And they have all these stories to illustrate the point.
Oh.
Well, the poor widow who gave her last 2 mites
Yeah.
wasn't much, but Jesus praised her because it came from a heart full of love and faith.
I love that story. It really challenges us to think about what true sacrifice really is. It's not about giving what's easy or convenient. It's about giving from a heart that's truly overflowing with love for God, isn't it?
You got it. And it shows us that even small acts of giving, done with the right heart, they mean something to God.
That's encouraging. We don't have to be millionaires to make a difference.
We don't.
So how do we take all these amazing principles and actually put them into practice? Like, what's the takeaway for our everyday lives? I bet these sources have some practical advice.
They do. A lot of it boils down to making choices about how we use our resources.
Okay.
One key thing they suggest is making a budget.
Okay.
And including giving back to God right from the start.
I like that. Making it a priority, not just an afterthought.
Exactly. And they also talk about being more thoughtful about how we spend,
Yeah.
choosing needs over wants,
Yeah.
and avoiding unnecessary debt.
It sounds like stewardship is about more than just our money, though, right? It's about how we handle our time, our talents, our relationships.
Absolutely right.
It's about recognizing that everything is a gift and that we need to use it wisely.
Exactly.
Speaking of making a difference, I know the sources also highlighted how generosity can have this ripple effect, right? Like, it can impact the whole world.
Yeah, they really emphasize that. It's easy to think what we do doesn't really matter, but they have all these inspiring stories that show just how much impact even small acts of giving can have.
Like what? What are some of the stories that they told?
Well, there's that story about the widow who shared her last meal with Elijah during the famine.
Oh, yeah, she had so little, but her faith and generosity were just incredible.
Yeah. It's amazing how God can work through ordinary people to do extraordinary things when they're willing to be channels of His blessings.
It's truly inspiring. So we've covered quite a bit in this first part of our deep dive. We've gone from these core principles of stewardship all the way to the history of tithing.
Yeah.
And we've seen how these ideas can really make us rethink not just what we give, but how we live.
And we're just getting started.
I know, I'm already hooked.
In the next part, we'll dive even deeper into what this looks like practically,
Yeah.
We'll explore the dangers of debt, the wisdom of planning for the future, and how powerful it is to align our motives with God's boat.
I can't wait. If you're enjoying this deep dive on Christian stewardship, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next installment. We'll be back with even more insights from these incredible sources.
Picking up where we left off, let's dig into some of the practical advice these sources offer. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was this strong warning against debt, unnecessary debt. It's clear that this was a big concern for these authors.
Yeah, they really saw it as a spiritual issue, not just a financial one.
Absolutely. They talked about how being debt-free allows us to be more fully available to God, to serve Him, without this constant burden weighing us down.
It's like it frees us up to be more responsive to His leading, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And remember that intense comparison they used?
Oh, yeah, the leprosy thing. I still think about that one.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Debt wasn't just a financial inconvenience for them. It was something that could really harm us spiritually.
Which is interesting because these days, debt is almost seen as a normal part of life.
Mm-hmm.
We go into debt for houses, cars, even education. It seems like these sources are challenging that whole mindset.
They are. They're calling us to a higher standard, one that prioritizes freedom and simplicity over just accumulating stuff, which often comes with a lot of debt.
Okay, so practical steps. How do we actually live this out? What do these sources say about avoiding debt and making wise financial decisions?
A lot of it comes down to those basic principles we all know but don't always practice, like living within our means, making a budget, being disciplined with our spending. It sounds simple, but the challenge is sticking with it.
It's about building those good habits that help us resist the temptation to live beyond our means.
That's it. And they also talk about planning for the future, thinking ahead, not just for the moment.
Yeah, that's important, especially in a culture that's so focused on instant gratification.
Right. It's about taking responsibility for managing what we've been given so we can be prepared for whatever comes our way, whether it's unexpected expenses supporting our families or investing in God's work.
They even talk about being careful not to overbuild or get caught up in risky ventures that could lead to financial instability.
Yeah, it's about being prudent and avoiding unnecessary risk.
And I noticed they also talk about seeking wise counsel from others, especially those who have experience in financial matters.
Absolutely. They have this great story about the need for wise counsel before making any major financial decision.
It's so easy to get caught up in our own enthusiasm or even our fears and make impulsive decisions. Having wise counsel can really help us see things more clearly.
I agree. It helps us make decisions based on wisdom and careful consideration, not just emotions or impulses.
I also found it fascinating that they applied these principles of stewardship to institutions too, like churches and schools. It's not just about individual responsibility, it's about being good stewards of the resources that are entrusted to these organizations as well.
That's a great point. They really emphasized avoiding institutional debt and being responsible with the resources that are given to these organizations.
I love that story they told about building the church and school at Avondale. Even though they faced financial challenges, they were able to complete the project without going into debt. It's really inspiring.
It is. It shows what can be accomplished when we're committed to God's work and willing to trust in His provision.
Speaking of trusting in God's provision, one of the most powerful concepts I saw in these writings was this idea that when we give generously, God pours out blessings on us. It's almost like a spiritual law of abundance.
That's a great way to put it. It goes back to that passage in Malachi where God says, "Test me in this. Bring your tithes and offerings into the storehouse, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it."
It's like the more we give away, the richer we become. It's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. It challenges our human understanding of scarcity and invites us to step into a different reality, one where God's abundance reigns.
And the sources are full of stories that illustrate this principle in action.
So many.
Like the widow who shared her last meal with Elijah and was miraculously sustained, or Nehemiah who received unexpected favor from the king when he needed resources to rebuild Jerusalem.
It's amazing to see how God works through ordinary people to accomplish incredible things when they're willing to be channels of His blessings.
So we've talked about the practical side of stewardship, but what about the spiritual dimension? What did these sources say about that?
Well, one thing that really resonated with me was this idea of experiencing true freedom and joy when we embrace these principles of stewardship. They argue that when we live in alignment with God's will, there's this sense of peace and purpose that flows from it.
So it's about more than just following rules. It's about aligning our hearts with God's heart and experiencing the joy that comes from that alignment.
Exactly. And there was this beautiful passage that talked about laying up treasures in heaven. It's about investing in something that has eternal value, something that transcends the fleeting pleasures of this world.
What does that look like practically? Is it just about giving money?
It's much bigger than that. It's about investing our time, our talents, and our love in things that will last for eternity. It's about using everything we have to advance God's kingdom and bring His light to those who are in darkness.
There was this powerful image in one of the sources about the redeemed gathering in heaven and rejoicing over the souls they've helped to save. It really gives a whole new meaning to leaving a legacy.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the profound joy that comes from knowing that we've made a difference in the lives of others, a joy that far surpasses any earthly reward.
I think there's a common thread running through all of this. True stewardship isn't just about outward actions, but about an inward transformation that aligns our hearts with God's.
That's such a crucial point. We've talked about so many practical aspects, but it all comes back to this. It's not just about doing the right things, it's about doing them with the right heart.
Which leads to a question that's both fascinating and a bit daunting. How do we know if our motives are pure? It's not always easy to discern what's truly in our hearts, is it?
It's true, our hearts can be tricky. But the sources do offer some guidance. They encourage us to examine our priorities, to consider what motivates our choices, and to ask God to reveal any hidden selfishness or pride that might be lurking beneath the surface.
So it's about being honest with ourselves and with God, and being willing to let go of any motivations that aren't aligned with His will.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process, not a one-time fix. It's about continually surrendering our hearts to God and allowing Him to refine our motives, purify our desires, and make us more and more like Him.
It's a process of continual surrender and refinement, wouldn't you say?
I love that. It captures the essence of what it means to be a faithful steward. As we grow in our relationship with God, our motives become more pure and our giving becomes a truer reflection of His love flowing through us.
And that's what makes this whole conversation about stewardship so compelling. It's not just about managing money or following rules. It's about allowing God to transform our hearts and minds, to shape our desires, and to empower us to live a life of true generosity and abundance.
It's about recognizing that everything we have is a gift, and that the greatest joy comes from using those gifts to bless others and to advance God's kingdom.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but the sources have given us so much to think about. We've unpacked practical advice, explored thought-provoking stories, and grappled with the deeper spiritual implications of stewardship. If you're finding this conversation as engaging as I am, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the final part of this deep dive. We've still got some important territory to cover, including a powerful question that has the potential to change the way you view your entire life. Don't miss it. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Christian stewardship. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. We've covered so much ground. From tithing and generosity to wise financial management and even the dangers of debt.
But as we wrap up, I think it's important to come back to something we talked about earlier, the importance of our motives.
You mean how it's not just about doing the right things, but doing them with the right heart?
Exactly. The sources really emphasized that, didn't they?
Yeah. Absolutely. One of them even said that God sees beyond our outward actions. He's looking at the motivation behind our giving. It's not about trying to impress Him or earn His favor. It's about letting our actions flow from a heart that's truly aligned with His.
It makes me think of that story about Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts. They tried to look generous, but secretly held back some of their offering. And the consequences were pretty serious.
It's a powerful reminder that God values sincerity and integrity more than anything. Our giving should be an expression of genuine love for God and a desire to do His work, not a way to make ourselves look good.
One of the sources talked about the danger of giving for selfish reasons. It said that even if the outcome is good, if our motives are wrong, we miss the whole point.
I agree. True generosity comes from a place of selflessness, not self-promotion. It's about shifting our focus from ourselves to others, from what we can get to what we can give.
It's about being a channel for God's love and grace, letting His abundance flow through us to touch the lives of those around us.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it's not just about money either, right?
No, not at all. It's about giving our time, our talent, our compassion. It's about noticing the needs around us and responding generously however we can.
Yes. One of the sources compared our acts of service to incense rising up to God. It said that a sincere heart filled with love for God and others is the most fragrant offering.
I love that imagery. But it also makes me wonder, how do we know if our motives are pure? It's not always easy to see into our own hearts, is it?
You're right. Our hearts can be complicated, and sometimes we even deceive ourselves. But the sources do offer some helpful advice. They encourage us to look closely at our priorities, to consider what's really driving our choices, and to ask God to reveal any hidden selfishness or pride that might be lurking beneath the surface.
So it's about being honest with ourselves and with God and being willing to let go of anything that isn't aligned with His will.
Exactly. And it's a journey, not a destination. It's about continually surrendering our hearts to God and letting Him refine our motives and make us more like Him.
You know, one thing that really stood out to me was this idea that while rewards are a natural consequence of faithful stewardship, they shouldn't be our primary motivation. The focus should always be on glorifying God and serving others.
Absolutely. The blessings will come, but they're not the goal. If we're focused on what we can get out of it, we've already missed the point.
There's that great story about Peter asking Jesus what the disciples would get after leaving everything to follow Him. And Jesus gently redirects their focus, reminding them that true discipleship isn't about seeking rewards. It's about selfless service and complete surrender to God's will.
It's a great reminder that following Jesus isn't a transaction, it's a transformation. It's about dying to ourselves and living for Him, trusting that He'll take care of us as we seek to do His will.
We've covered so much in this deep dive. We've gone from the practical details of stewardship to the transformative power of aligning our hearts with God's heart. It's been such a rich and challenging conversation.
I agree. We've seen how Christian stewardship isn't just about finances. It's about every aspect of our lives. It's about recognizing that everything we have is a gift and using it wisely and generously.
We've learned that generosity isn't just about money. It's about giving ourselves our time, our talents, our love. It's about reflecting God's grace and compassion to everyone around us.
And it's about finding true joy in living in harmony with God's will, using everything He's given us to make a difference in this world.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final question. It's one of those questions that has the power to change how we see everything.
Oh, what is it?
It simply asks, if you truly believe that everything you have is a gift from God, how would that change not just what you give, but how you live?
Wow, that's a powerful question. Makes you think about all your choices, big and small, and ask yourself, am I really living as a grateful steward of all that God has given me?
It's a question we can keep asking ourselves long after this deep dive is over. It can guide us to a life filled with meaning, joy, and purpose.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. I hope you found this deep dive as insightful as I have.
And if you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our future episodes, where we'll be exploring even more fascinating and challenging topics.
Yeah.
Until then, keep seeking, keep growing, and keep giving.